Thanks, Nigel, for that introduction. So yeah, I am going to talk about my kind of gateway into the urban landscape and where kind of what I've taken inspiration from and also who I've taken inspiration from over the past 10 years since I've been researching and documenting urbanicity. So before kind of I started being interested in the urban landscape, I was very much a landscape painter. I am from Wiltshire, so I've had this connection to the countryside, and I've always been interested in documenting my journeys. So I would paint idyllic scenes of the rural landscapes. But it wasn't until I studied on my BA that I was introduced to the works of John Virtue. And for me, his monotypes and his paintings contain this element of excitement and energy that I wasn't getting in my paintings. And this, I came across him for a moment of serendipity when I visited Somerset House, and I just popped in to go to the toilet, and as I exited, there were these huge monotypes of his work. And I hadn't previously heard of monotype before, so on my BA, I just started the BA and I was going backwards and forwards to London, and I got back to the studio where I was studying and asked what is a monotype, and they showed me this process, and that was it. I'd become absolutely hooked on monoprinting. And because I was going to the city, it was more drama than the urban, the rural landscape. There was, I don't know if you find this, but I find cities very overwhelming. There's a buzz, there's an excitement, but also a bit of a fear that it's just massive and I'm feeling quite engulfed in it. But I would go up frequently and I would draw, and drawing is a massive part of my practice. It underpins the work that I do. I'm going to say this cliche thing that I've always been a drawer since I was a child. So even today, that is very prevalent in my work. So I was taking inspiration from John Virtue's work, and what I loved about his work also was the fact that he just used black and white. He saw colour as a distraction. And I think there's something really powerful with the monochrome, and I still work in monochrome today. So I was making lots of monoprinting in the studio, and I've become obsessed with this process. I would spend hours just reworking the monoprint plate, working in layers. And again, that resonated with the cityscapes. When you go to a city, it's complicated, it's complex, there's layers, there's history, there's people. So these monoprints, these are about 10 years old now, so obviously my work has developed since then. But at the same time, I was also working in the darkroom making photograms, so drawing onto transparent film, and this fed into the monoprints, which then fed back into the monograms, and then fed into large-scale paintings. So because the urban landscape, cities, are so engulfing, I was making these huge paintings where I wanted the viewer to feel like they were in the built environment, and they were witnessing all these kind of textures and kind of the energy of the space. Okay. So at the time, when I was studying my BA, I was really heavily influenced by the work of Anselm Kiefer. And for those of you who don't know him, he's a German abstract expressionist painter, sculptor. His work is all-encompassing. And what I loved about his work was not so much the subject matter. He's kind of subject matter, but more about the process he was using within his paintings. So there's a real physicality to his practice where he uses lead, concrete, ash, clay, like natural forms. So his paintings are constantly in a state of flux. They're not fixed. There's this forever changing kind of feeling to these plates. The fact that he's using sunflowers that aren't ever going to be permanent. So there's a sense of alchemy in his work, and from that, I was really drawn to his textural qualities of the paintings that he was doing. So he layers and layers paint, and that led me down to or the click, I know, to looking at more of the micro of the urban landscape. So focusing on textures and surfaces that has physically been altered by erosion down to weathering or, natural decay or vandalism, graffiti, and kind of capturing these layers of history through making a series of colograph plates. So for me, colographs allowed me to represent the layers in the landscape, and it was also an introduction into intaglio printmaking methodologies. I could also use discarded waste products and use textural materials, so I become a bit of a magpie in terms of looking for things that could resonate with the built environment I was recording. So after my BA, so my BA was in drawing. I did a 3-year drawing degree, and at the time when I did my degree, which like I said was maybe over 10 years ago now, I didn't want to go and do a fine art degree and learn how to bullshit my way through the art world. I wanted to go and learn how to learn skills. And after my BA, I did an internship at London Print Studio, which is where I met printmakers who were making a living out of their work, which sounded pretty cool. And so from then, I moved to Bristol and I did a multidisciplinary printmaking MA at the University of the West of England. And the question here, what do you want, what do you need, is a prevailing question, which has really shaped my practice of what you see it today. So I ditched the colographs and we're using way more advanced methods of documenting spaces and the landscape. So being in a new city, a new town, I record my experiences through the urban landscape via a sketchbook and a camera. So I do this thing called psychogeography, which some of you may or may have not heard of, and it's the act of wandering without purpose, experiencing new aspects of the urban environment, which often illuminates forgotten and disregarded parts. And this is what happened when I was just bumbling around the city. I came across this structure on the harbour, which was the new jail. Obviously, it's not new at all now. It's completely, most of it has gone. It's kind of been knocked down and it's been repurposed. But this still remained, and I become obsessed with this form. I had no idea what it was. It was this like crumbling tooth that was jutted out of the landscape, and I would go there most weekends and draw and just experience it, and got to the point where I built up enough confidence to go behind the barrier and sneak inside to see what the inside of this carcass, was what I was greeted with. And it was this, it's quite a poetic feeling going into an abandoned building, because it's not a dead space at all. There's a sense of fluidity and a state of flux. There's life within these kind of abandoned spaces. So at the time, I was still drawing and I was still monoprinting. So monoprinting is still very heavily part of my practice. It's a way to understand a space, understand a form, and it allows me to break down tonal values in a composition, which then I take into an etching or a lithograph. At the time, I was kind of researching into artists who was also documenting ruination, so people who were looking at the disregarded parts of the built environment, like I had found in the new jail. So I was looking at the works of John Piper and Graham Sutherland, who were both wartime artists, and they were documenting these kind of real tragic scenes of post-war, the buildings that had been completely obliterated by the Blitz. And I think their work contains this sense of nostalgia for a lost time, but equally a statement about the present and also the future. Actually our future is very uncertain at the moment. So even these that were made in the mid-20th century, there's still that resignation that actually we're going through, what could be the 6th mass extinction. So they're dark, kind of profound paintings really kind of grabbed my attention, and what I loved about their work was the fact that light plays a heavy part in what they were recording, highlighting these decaying and crumbling buildings, and also the way that they use blocks of tone and blocks of colour. They don't really make any sense, like the colours they use, but for some reason it just works, and it kind of pulls you into the scene. So I kind of started making more monotypes, and I started to etch. So previously I had done no etching whatsoever, and there was something really magical about being introduced to etching at UE. I'd done it previously on aluminium and used the safe, the big red and the blue etching solution, but didn't really have successful results, so I kind of ditched etching. But when we had the intro into copper plate etching, I felt like my whole world had just changed. It opened up this new door of making. The fact that, there was this, just to begin with, you're holding a flame to a plate and there's fire and it's exciting, and then you're gliding a needle through the copper plate to reveal the shiny metal, and then the alchemy of it in the acid bath. And so I was taking the drawings that I was making of the new jail and turning them into etchings, and really exploring architectural kind of work. So previously my work was very abstract, looking at the micro of the landscape and the fluidity of the built environment using monotypes. But what etching allowed was this record of a form that I felt needed documenting, because I couldn't foresee a future for it. It was unloved, it was falling deeper into disrepair. So to work out what the building was for, I undertook a residency at Bristol Record Office to delve into their archive and to discover the history of the fragment on the harbour. And what my research denoted was actually this was the gatehouse to the jail, but it also doubled up as an execution platform. So where I was, happily stood drawing many hours, hundreds of people had died where I was kind of spent that time. So this then developed a kind of fixation in learning more about Bristol's history and learning about what else there could be, where people are just walking past and ignoring these kind of obsolete buildings. So I ended up making an artist's book called Flux, and it was the story of this abandoned building, and it was a 9-plate etchings printed onto one sheet of Hahnemuller. So during my MA, it's probably no surprise that Piranesi has been a massive influence on my work. He was born in Venice but moved to Rome, and he trained as an architect, but is most known for kind of recording the antiquities of Rome, because he could not foresee a future for them. And unlike today, where we are very lucky to have organisations and charities that look after our historic monuments and buildings, back then none of that existed. So they would just let buildings fall completely into chaos and disrepair. If any of you ever get to go to the V&A, they have 4 bound volumes of these etchings, and they're just exquisite. Because he's trained as an architect, they're structurally sound, and he always puts figures in his work, so you get this scale of how monumental and massive these spaces are that he's documenting. He also uses a very clever use of angles. So his prison series, the way that they make no sense, they're stairways that don't lead anywhere, but the way that he uses again, tone, line, it creates this feeling of these huge spaces. I was also looking at contemporary artists who have influenced me. So Michael Guerrero, he's a Chicago-based artist, and he describes his art as a continuous creative search for raw authenticity in the urban environments and human forms that are constantly changing. So an etching allows him to to be more expressive and also more aggressive with image making. So he's also a painter, but what etching allows him is to use the metal as a way of creating these really intense, powerful images of the built environment. And I read an article about describing his process, and he will, before even putting a ground on the plate, he will run it over with his car, he'll chuck hammers at it, he'll really ruffle up the copper so that he's got something to work against. And in his work, he always has a reflection, so whether that is water or a mirror, which I think really does, as a viewer, put yourself into that scene, so that you are kind of experiencing that landscape. Oh, I forgot to talk about Ian Chamberlain as well. Those of you who don't know his work, he also kind of deals with subject matters about the obsolete and kind of communication technologies that no longer are needed. And because I'm based in South West and so is Ian, I've seen his work for many, many years and have always been drawn to the way that he uses the light and darkness that, again, kind of gives his etchings real gravitas and form. And his work, like Piranesi, serves as a visual historic document and the places that he has visited. So I guess you can kind of start to see a theme emerging about who I'm interested in and the way that they are actually documentary printmakers or artists recording the forever changing environment. So I got a new obsession after the jail, and that was recording the abandoned buildings in Bristol. So again, using psychogeography as a method of research, just wandering the city streets in search for abandonment. And there's every building I've been into, I start to get more confidence in going into a space. There's this real thrill and apprehension of going into abandoned buildings, like who's going to be in there? Will I get caught? What will I find? Is it safe? Should I be going in there? So all these questions enter my mind before even stepping foot into a space. And this one in particular, this was the first building that I went into where it was bigger than the jail. It was a vast space. It's called Whitfield Tabernacle, and it's in North Bristol. And it's built in 1741, so it's the oldest space that I visited. And actually, right now they've just secured funding to turn it into a theatrical space. So what's really great about some of these buildings that I've gone into, I mean, most of them have been knocked down now or converted into luxury flats, but turning it back into an art space. So when I first entered this space, what kind of grabbed my attention was the eerie feel it had. It had this real kind of chill in the air. And this once was a religious meeting place, and now it's just derelict, and the roof's fallen in, and it's home to pigeons. There's shit everywhere. There's ivy, kind of climbing in through the windows. As soon as there's one way in for plants to grow, it will start to take over the space. So again, these aren't dead spaces, they're very much alive. And I started to see the beauty within these ruins. So a big kind of, I did a big body of work based on this place, which is the Elizabethshire Chocolate Factory. And it was built in 1901 when the chocolate industry in Bristol was really booming. There was about 9 chocolate factories, and this was the biggest. And it was firstly built by a company called Packers, which no longer exists. It closed in 2006. It was too expensive to modernise it, and which is, when you see a lot of abandoned buildings, that is the case. It's too expensive to redevelop it or to modernise it. So unfortunately, they just get pulled down. So I started to see myself as this kind of a modern day Piranesi, just going around Bristol and documenting all these abandoned spaces that I could not see a future for. And this space in particular, it's a huge Victorian warehouse, and it gave me that urbex bug, like the urban exploration. So seeking out these spaces. I also really love the fact that these are shared playgrounds. There's graffiti artists, there's photographers, there's artists. And when you meet somebody else in an abandoned space, you're almost part of the same society. You give each other a nod, being like, yeah, I know why you're here. And, you know, it's kind of safe to be in. And this was the last space I explored in Bristol. Sadly, there's not really many spaces left at all in the city. They've all been, as I said, pulled down and redeveloped. This was built in 1906, and it was a malt house, so to store malt to make beer in Bristol. But after the war, when there was restrictions and rations, it became an abandoned space and then taken over by artists for workshops and boat building. And then there was a fire and it was left abandoned, and now there's just flats going up, so it's quite sad. But again, a space like this is a city museum. It's a living space where artists meet, and graffiti artists use the walls as canvases. So on my MA, we were introduced to stone lithography, and this was the most exciting process I've ever used, and it still is. There's nothing more satisfying than drawing on a piece of fresh limestone that you spent hours lovingly graining, and drawing with crayons, touches, and you can't replicate the hand drawn in any other printmaking process. So I become obsessed with this process. As you can see, I've probably got a bit of an obsessive personality, but I spent my time on my MA working between etching and lithography, and they both share very similar kind of working processes. So, you know, I'm physically altering the makeup of a stone by acids, and the same goes with etching. And both of those processes resonate with what I'm recording. There's natural decay in the built environment as there is on this plate or stone. I'm enforcing that decay. And I started working big. So for me, these spaces that I explore, they demand your attention. They are monumental in scale. I was making small etchings and I just wasn't getting that vibe, so I went bigger. And when you go bigger, it allows you to be more gestural, it allows you to have more mark-making opportunities, and it allowed me to really understand the complexities of etching and how I can use aquatint to create these really dark, immersive prints. So these prints are 80 by 60 centimetres, so they were quite big for, I guess, just starting to etch. And they become quite architectural in themselves as well, but a bit more playful. So the way that I work is that I will do a series of drawings. I will then make a series of monoprints, and both those drawings and monotypes then feed into the etching process or the lithography process. So they become more freeing, and there's more gestural marks within the etch process. And this is a stone litho, so it's three stones that make up one image. And just hoping that I etched it correctly so that they all kind of made sense. So after my MA, or alongside my MA, I was working as a print technician at Spike Print Studio, and I was asked to support Jason Hicklin on a sugarlift workshop. And I'd been following Jason's work for years and really loved how he captures the feeling of the weather and the sense of light within his work. So I jumped at the chance of supporting him. And after the workshop, he told me about a fellowship scheme that he runs at the City and Guilds of London Art School. So for 2 years, I worked alongside Jason and other fellows in the studio in London. It's a very sweet, like kind of small traditional studio space. And again, I just learned how to etch the way that he etched. So he learnt from Norman Ackroyd. So there's this kind of historical passing down of master and apprentice. And for that fellowship, I was sponsored by the Queen Elizabeth Scholarship Trust. So for those of you who do not know about Quest, I'm just going to mention it briefly just because I'm one of their ambassadors. So they support British craft, and they have supported over 600 scholars and apprentices over 30 years, supporting 130 different types of disciplines to sustain British craftsmanship. So they're one to check out if you ever want funding for something. So for the fellowship, I had to propose a body of work that I would make to help me to push my etching skills a bit further. And because I had pretty much found all the abandoned spaces within Bristol, I decided I'd go into Wales because I knew that there was a lot of abandonment, especially within the valleys, where there would have been coal mines and communities, which now sadly do not exist. The communities are still there, but they're very much displaced. So I started roaming the valleys in Wales in search for buildings, mines, quarries, and kind of coming across a different feeling of urban environment. So for me, these are still very much urban spaces, although they're in towns that now don't really have much activity going on, but they're more monumental in scale. They're more industrial. You could kind of get this sense of the past that would have been there and the types of people and types of activity that would have happened in these spaces. Again, they're very haunting because at the height of the coal industry, there would have been thousands of people in these kind of coal pits, kind of beavering away. And what became really interesting to me was not so much really about the whole space, but looking at the minute details within these spaces and getting inspiration by the textures, the peeling off the paint, the peeling off the plaster, the rusty signs, which then all feed into the etchings that you would now see today. So taking those micro details like I was on my BA, but including them in a much more bigger scale. And also what gets left behind in these spaces are often scatterings of past work, people's items or objects or mugs, might have a locker with Dave on it. So who is Dave? So all these narratives come to play when I'm in these built up post-industrial spaces. And I love this one, this kind of stuffed cat and the saucepan and the drum kit. It's like, whose drum kit is that? And so for me it's about what gets left behind. They almost become like glorified waste, like tips. They are wastelands, but you also find very interesting objects within them. So at the time I was looking at artists who were also recording post-industrial landscapes. One person who has really influenced the way that I make is David Carpanini. And he solely devoted his life to the recording of post-industrial landscapes in the South Wales. And for me, these contain drama, and that is exactly how I feel when I'm in an industrial space. There is a sense of drama, and I think he records that very brilliantly in these in the etchings that he creates. And you can probably see that from my etchings, how I have been influenced by the people that I've so far have shown. So using reflections within my work to hopefully you get a feel that you're in the space and there's this atmospheric quality to them. I also started experimenting casting my etching plates. So I started using this process so that it resonated with the built environment. So I was making etchings and then casting them in herculite, which is the strength of concrete, but it will give you the aesthetic quality of plaster. And what this does, it creates what should be a 2D image on paper. It makes it more tangible. It becomes a 3D object that people can pick up and handle. And it's almost like Braille. So if you run your hand over the cast, it's brilliant, and it picks up such minute detail. And that's something that I'm just starting to go back to. So in 2019, I was commissioned by the Townscape Heritage Project in Birmingham in the Jewellery Quarter. And in like the 1900s, when jewellery making was at its peak, the Jewellery Quarter, it employed over 30,000 people. But because of kind of foreign competition and the lack of demand in the UK, it declined quite rapidly throughout the 20th century. But because this was a commission, I was given a guided tour and I was kind of shown the history side of the built environment and little details that you would just walk straight past and ignore. Like opposite jewelers' workshops, the walls would have been tiled in white tiles so that it reflected the optimum light into the workshop so the jewelers could set the stones quite easily, which I would have no idea, like would not really know that's why there's white walls in the Jewellery Quarter. And light played a really prevalent part in these etchings because they were built in the Victorian era. I've seen this kind of common, I guess, aesthetical quality in these architectural forms. They are built with huge windows that do flood the workshop spaces with huge amount of light, and that's what I wanted to portray in these etchings, was the sense of light and atmosphere. And now these spaces don't exist, so they are documents of historic buildings that have been destroyed. I also experimented with scales, so the works for the commission was exhibited at a place called the Hive, which is quite a big gallery space. So I needed to work big because the space was big. I didn't need to work big, but I wanted to work big. So the first etching I showed was 120 by 80, and that was 2 plates put together. And then I made these monotypes on silk, so they're 3 meters by 1 meter. And the reason why I wanted to use silk was because it has that transient quality, like these spaces that I'm documenting. They're not fixed, they're in a constant state of flux. And the movement of the silk almost allows for that kind of, it resonates with the movement of the environment that I'm recording. So I wanted the viewer to feel like they're almost in the space that I've been documenting. So the pandemic then hit, and I kind of didn't really do much printmaking at the beginning. But as soon as we were able to go back out into the real world, I started going back out into Wales. So at this point, the fellowship had ended, but I still wanted to continue this exploration of kind of rural settings where there is industrial landscapes. So there's still this element of the urban present within these spaces. And this was one place called Verne Works, and it's just outside Swansea, so it's between Swansea and Cardiff. I think that's right. And a huge space. Like, they used to make the Concorde wings here, so it needed that space. Obviously, they're big planes. So, and what I started to become interested in is what's left behind in these spaces and what starts to thrive in our wastelands. So, ecology starts to flourish, new habitats, new species will start to grow. And these spaces give me a glimmer of hope that if we continue to go down the path we're going down, that actually the world will still continue, nature will still thrive if we're not there. And again, starting to really concentrate on reflections. I love a puddle in an abandoned space, and I love visiting abandoned buildings after a storm because you do get this heightened sense of drama. And using Sugarlift a lot and using lithography crayons to stop out, so that I'm trying to experiment more using hand-drawn drawing materials on an etching plate to give it that more kind of energetic feel. So I mentioned about kind of nature reclaiming spaces, and this is an old mill that I came across in Taunton, near Wellington. Again, it's a Victorian mill, so they had these huge windows, but what was fascinating was that all the machinery was still left in this space. So there was a trace of the type of activity that once happened in this building. But interestingly, like, you could just about make it out because the swaths of ivy was just completely engulfing the machinery. And there's this beautiful contrast between the softness of the nature and then the harshness of the rust and the kind of the industrial machinery. And 20 years time, perhaps you won't even notice the rusty machinery anymore, and it will just be engulfed with nature. A bit like the workshop spaces. Well, I think this was a storage space for they used to make military outfits in this mill. But as you can see, it becomes like almost a rainforest inside. Like, it's bizarre. Well, it's impressive how nature will go into a building and just start popping up. This is a mill in Wales. And again, for me, what's interesting, what keeps me going back to abandonment and this exploration of decay is the fact that they're not dead spaces. They are in this state of flux, and nature is reclaiming it. So my etchings have started to get a bit more, I guess from the new jail series that was very architectural focused, they are started to become a bit more looser, and that's probably down to working with the likes of Jason, who does a lot of open biting, and his work is very textural heavy, and that's something I've been exploring in these series of works based on the Wellington textile mill. Again, using light as a way to draw the viewer in. And I'm just going to talk really briefly about kind of a new direction that I'm currently going through. So I've just been awarded an Arts Council grant to document the clay pits in St Austell. So maybe not like it's not urban in terms of our built environment, our cities, but actually these spaces are the clay pits. In particular in St Austell, they're 25 mile radius of white open cast quarries, and they are otherworldly. But we use the kaolin from this pit to use in the built environment and our everyday activities. So I've just started going down to Cornwall and recording these clay pits using drawing as my first primary medium, and then taking them into monoprints. And the funding, the DYCP funding, is to make big etching plates and then cast them in porcelain, so that there's that resignation with the sites that I'm recording and the processes that I'm using to record them. So this body of work is exploring new stratas that I've not investigated previously, and I guess over the pandemic, it's really allowed me to think a bit more deeply about my practice and what it is that I want to say and what it is that I want to make work about. And one of them is the scarring of the landscape. So looking at the scars of post-industrial landscapes and the kind of the way that we're going through a new epoch of the Anthropocene. And in the summer, I'll be doing a residency in Derby called the Lodge Project, where I hope to kind of begin that understanding about the true meaning of industrial loss and the impact it has on the built environment, but also the communities within them. So the work that I'll be making about St Austell will be exhibited at Nantgarw, which is this very historic building just outside of Cardiff. And they have these abandoned workshop spaces. So I'll be making work about the history of the site, and there's the St Austell clay pits, because Nantgarw uses the clay from St Austell, so there's that really beautiful link between the two buildings, or the two heritage sites. And also doing some work about this slate mines in Snowdonia. So looking at, again, how industrial processes really do impact the landscape. And at one point, the slate would have been used all over Wales, the roofs, and it's left scars on the landscape. And we for years, humans have been earth movers. We are essentially like shapeshifters. We we move rocks and we reform the landscape, and that's what I've become really interested in. Also the remnants of these workshop spaces. So this is in Denoric, which is opposite Snowdon. And at the top of Denoric is this old, it's called the Australian Workshop. And it's like, it's bizarre because this is at the top of a mountain. So to get the slate up and down would have been a right challenge. But obviously great, rewarded with great views of Snowdon. And so I'm just starting to make work about these sites using monoprinting as a way of kind of starting to understand how I might approach the etching plates or stones. And this is kind of what I've been working on since January. So making a series of lithographs based on the slate mines in Snowdonia. And I think that's the end of my slides. Yes, thank you.